Good morning, class, or whatever time it is around you. But we are towards the end of our tiptoeing through the phyla. I could not get this to sound any better. We are going to be talking about a very large group and a very important group, Phylum Chordata. And Phylum Chordata refers to a notochord or a spinal cord in some way. And depending on the time that they have it, we kind of split them into different groups. So without further ado, we are going to be talking about each one of these classes in general, or subphylums, and then getting into the classes. Basically, we're going to be talking about two early groups that aren't actually in the subphylum Vertebrata, okay? But they are grouped with the chordates, and so you're going to need to know the specific reasons or definitions of a chordate in general, because that will give you an idea why these two are here, because they look very different, and then why they aren't in Vertebrata. And with other phylogenetic trees or phyla trees, we are splitting them off by characteristics, as in they all have a vertebrate past these two groups, and then we split them off as having jaws for everything else, or no jaws, or lungs, and versus gills, things like that. So you should know characteristic split, or something that is special for each of these classes. So when we're talking about Phylum Chordata, it has a large range, everything from mammals and us, birds, fish, amphibians, and some others. Basically, we tie them all together by the following characteristics. At some time in their development, and I emphasize sometime in their development, they will have each of these characteristics. When we look at embryos, they all look somewhat similar in some way, shape, or form. They have some physical characteristics. We have this cephalization, or head, and the what we call the dorsal hollow nerve cord. It is not a spinal column as of yet for some of these, but we do have a support system in here instead of just a mass of tissue. It's called the notochord, and this is a pressurized sac. Think of it as the balloons for a balloon animal, long tubes. They can be stretched, but unless you tie it into a certain way, when you bend it and then let go, it snaps back to its original slightly curved conformation. That's because it's pressurized. In this case, it's somewhat pressurized with liquid inside, and something like cartilage. And both of these will give it some rigidity and some structure, so that when there is pressure or movement or bending, it will actually increase the pressure. So when released, it'll snap back to the original grown structure, because that's the least pressure system that you have. So we have this dorsal hollow nerve cord. Most of them will keep it. We have a notochord, and most of the groups or classes will keep this, but have it develop to encircle the dorsal hollow nerve cord. Then we have something called pharyngeal slits. They look awfully like some of the marine animals' gill slits, and sometimes they are developmentally turned into gill slits, where there's a lot of blood system going around them, so it can pick up, using surface area, pick up the oxygen and drop off the CO2. But that isn't the case for all animals. For humans, we do not have gills. I am not going to ask you that on the test. Not this year. But these pharyngeal slits are actually tissues that will differentiate in different parts of the either intestinal tract, lungs, circulatory system, or even the thymus. So these parts will be used in different ways, even though it looks like gills. So pharyngeal pouches or slits are what we call them. All of these chordates have a postanal tail. Here's the anus. Post means beyond or behind. Post anal tail. Even humans have that. And for the most part, we lose ours during the development from embryo to a full term baby. So these four characteristics are what define chordata. I would like you to add one more in, and that is the thyroid. The thyroid is a specialized piece of tissue that helps control metabolic activities. It has a a number of specialized enzymes that stay in there. It is a endocrine and exocrine gland, mostly endocrine, that will have the blood system go through it, and it helps control growth, metabolism, and things like that. Now, not all of the animals have a fully, it's usually around the throat in kind of a butterfly pattern, a group on one side and a group on another. And for humans, it's lightly joined in the middle. Other animals will have it on either side, but even these small, odd looking organisms that we're going to look at in the subphylums also have a thyroid. It's just a thyroid like tissue. So it seems like more and more, even though this isn't the official uh, declaration that this is a fifth characteristic, it seems to be that this is another type of organization in all chordates. So make sure to have a single hollow nerve cord or dorsal hollow nerve cord because it's on the dorsal side, notochord, pharyngeal slits, a postanal tail, and then a thyroid. So we are going to first talk about the subphylums of lancelets and tunicates. So lancelet, I don't expect you to know subphylum Cephalochordata. Cephalo meaning head and cord, notochord, but it's kind of fish-like, except it's only about a centimeter long, centimeter to an inch max. Now, this is called the simplest organism. It has a lot of characteristics that are interesting because we go from organisms that do not have these characteristics, except for maybe, I would argue, the sea urchin, and then go to this very complicated organism. So there is a evolutionary split or divide, more like the Grand Canyon crevasse, because a lot of these would not just happen on their own. They would have to develop one piece, wait for eons until the next piece that would work with it to develop, and so on and so forth. That's a lot of resources wasted, and therefore how to develop if it's going by current evolutionary theory. That being said, there is organization to this. Now, here is the head. It's called an oral hood. It has these little feeding tentacles and this kind of large, almost like sucker mouth, but it's really a filter feeder. It'll stick its tail into the sediment and let the water wash through it, and it'll collect sediment or collect macro nutrients. It will go through here and then push out through its pharyngeal slits. Now, you'll also notice that the pharyngeal slits have these kind of colander-like separations, and they have little cilia that will help catch the macronutrients and push it down its esophagus to the gut, where it's going to be broken down for food, and then it takes up these nutrients through the intestine, and then there's that anus and the postanal tail. So we're already finding that it has pharyngeal slits, has a postanal tail, has this thing called a notochord, which is along the back underneath the dorsal hollow nerve cord. So it fits all the characteristics that we are looking for in a chordate. It also has some small amount of thyroid-like tissue in it and is not shown here. So what we also look at is the blood system, and I really think this is interesting. It has a closed circulatory system, of course. It has something like a heart, and it pumps it in a directional way. But these are the pharyngeal slits. The pharyngeal slits shown here that help collect macronutrients. So the water comes in and goes out, and it goes past these blood vessels that have the blood going in one direction. So it's almost like a cross or a countercurrent exchange for blood and water. So it's exchanging CO2 and getting oxygen. This is a small organism. It doesn't need too much. So it is enough for it to go. But that's basically like a very early gill. Essentially what you have. You just add surface area to this. So it's a fascinating organism for being so small. And you should know why it has the characteristics it does and how it counts to be in the phylum Chordata. This is one of the most beautiful areas of the subphylum, if I was to pick between the two of them, and this is the tunicates. And tunicates can look like this. They are small, they're beautiful, they have inside lining, and then something that looks like almost like a shirt put on the outside, a tunic, if you will. They're also known as sea squirts because some of them can get large enough where they'll squirt water at you when they're startled or handled roughly. But there's a number of tunicates that are in this flat, very characteristic shape like this, and will be flat and almost look like sponges, almost like actually toothpaste on with holes in it on coral or what have you. But these organisms have alternating generation lifestyle. That means their young characteristics or their larval characteristics look very different than the sessile adult here. And again, I don't think you need to know Chordata for this. Now, what happens? Why do we even count this? This doesn't look like it has a notochord, a postanal tail, pharyngeal slits, a thyroid, any of this. So what happens is the larva will swim around with this tail. It has an anus, kind of, sort of, out here. Oops, there. And it also has a notochord and a dorsal hollow nerve cord in this kind of flagella-like thing. It has this pharyngeal slit set. It's a lot more slits than what we usually think about, but it has all the characteristics. It swims around for a while until it comes to a correct place to land and live its life, its best life. And what happens is these two little pads here are almost like landing pads for a spaceship. And they have this adhesive glue. As soon as they make contact with the surface and they've decided to stay there, within 5 minutes of crashing and attaching to that surface, they start breaking down their notochord and their dorsal hollow nerve cord. It has served its purpose and they do not need it anymore. When I say flagella for this, I should say it's basically like muscles that'll pull it one way and muscles that'll pull it the other way, but they don't have muscles that'll pull it back to center. Basically, they pull the muscles one way, the tail goes that way, and then they relax, and the notochord snaps it back, allowing for some force moving forward. So 5 minutes, it's retracting this. This is older than me as well. A car antenna. They used to be very long and metal, and the height of luxury at one point is to be able to touch a button and retract your antenna. And these you can actually, or at least with these tunicate junior tunicates, they can do that. They break down all of it, reuse it for um, resources to grow and change. And you'll notice that the dorsal hollow nerve cord is gone, the notochord is gone, the pharyngeal slits are still there, except they're getting an they have a hole. They'll bring in water, filter it through these little holes that have something called stigmata in them, and then go to the stomach. You'll collect all the water, all the nutrients in there, and bring them to the stomach and intestine, and then poop it out basically back into this sleeve. The water goes uh, through the stigmata, these holes in the pharyngeal slits, and then back out. So it has a flow through of water, kind of like the sponge, except the sponge doesn't have pharyngeal slits. There is a force of water going on in here driven by flagella. So it's somewhat similar to the um, sponge yet again. So in the end, the adult doesn't have much besides thyroid-like tissues down here and this pharyngeal slits. When you look at a cross cut, it's interesting. Here are the stigmata, these overgrown loops of tissue between these pharyngeal slits, or what used to be pharyngeal slits. The water goes through these openings, but the cilia definitely catch any macronutrients, and then the cilia pass the food down to the stomach. It does have a heart. It does have a circulatory system. It is not closed. It is almost closed, but it is still a fascinating organism that follows and fits all the characteristics of a chordate, and therefore it is in this group. It follows the characteristics of the chordate at one time. This is probably a good time to pause before we go on to the next group.